When I originally selected database objects for the model, I skipped some of the stored procedures and said I'd get back to them in a bit. You've seen that the stored procedures I did select were transformed into methods that I can call from my DB context class, and for those that return results, complex types were automatically generated also. I want to talk more about the stored procedures I already pulled in and then return to those that I skipped at the time. We've already looked a bit at the functions and complex types that were created from the stored procedures and functions I brought in earlier. It just so happened that all of the procedures were ones which return results. But you can also import procedures that just do something in the database and don't return anything. In that case, you'll get the function and the method in the context class, but there won't be a complex type created. Another thing I wanted to be sure you saw about these functions is that most of these procedures have parameters. For example, this annual customer sales procedure has a parameter for fiscal year. If we look at the function in the model browser, we can see that it too has a parameter, and the method that was created by the code generator also has a parameter. So the designer and the code generator ensure that the parameter that the procedure needs is collected and passed along when the procedure is executed. You can also have multiple parameters as well as output parameters. Another notable point about how the wizard handled the procedures and functions is that by default it will always create a complex type for the results, but it may not always be necessary, and it's up to you to correct this. For example, if you look at the order details procedure, it returns all of the columns from sales order detail. Because I haven't customized the sales order detail entity, it too maps to all of the columns of the same table. That means the order details procedure will return a type that matches our entity. So rather than having a new complex type, I can edit the function mapping to indicate that the result is the entity type, and then I can remove the complex type completely. So I can do that by right-clicking on the order details function import and opening up the edit wizard. And instead of returning a collection of order details result, I'll go ahead and select the sales order detail entity and then click OK to save it. Once I save the model itself, the Entity Framework Designer forces the code to be regenerated, and you can see that the order details method now returns object result of sales order detail, not object result of order details result. Another benefit of returning an entity rather than a complex type is the entity will get change tracked by Entity Framework, whereas a complex type doesn't. So now I can use this procedure to return editable data. So now to the procedures I skipped earlier. The designer supports another use of stored procedures, where we can use those procedures whenever we need to update, insert, or delete entities in the database. That'll override the default behavior, which is that Entity Framework creates update, insert, and delete commands on the fly when it's time to save changes. The reason I didn't select them earlier was because I didn't want import functions to be created for these procedures along with the others. So now I want to go pull them in with the update model from Database Wizard. Here are my other three stored procedures: delete customer, insert customer, and update customer. The insert and update procedures involve all of the columns of the customer table in the database. And again, because my customer entity still maps directly to that table, I know I'll be able to provide all of the correct parameters for these procedures. The delete just takes an ID and deletes the appropriate row from the database table. So I'll go ahead and select all three of those. And then the important thing that I want to do here is I want to deselect import selected stored procedures and functions. That's the feature of the wizard that automatically created the import functions along with the complex types when they were necessary. So for these, I don't want import functions. I could have selected them originally and then just deleted the import functions that had been created, but I wanted you to see this feature as well, so I went the longer route. So I'll go ahead and click Finish. And if we open up function imports, you can see that I don't have new function imports related to the stored procedures that I just selected. As a matter of fact, the stored procedures are not represented anywhere in this model, but we can look at the storage part of the model. This is the part that represents the schema of the database, and it's now aware of those three stored procedures. It didn't know about them before because we hadn't pulled them in. Now what I want to do is something called stored procedure mapping. What I'll do with this mapping is I'm going to map the customer entity in the model to these stored procedures. So I'm going to right-click on here and choose Stored Procedure Mapping. And you can see that this gives me the ability to map this customer to something that will perform the insert, something that will perform the update, and something that will perform the delete. I'll select the appropriate method for insert. You can see that the designer did its best job of matching up the parameter names to existing properties. Since we had changed the first name property to first, I have to give it a little assistance here. So I'll say that goes to first. All of the parameters that are required for the insert are now mapped to the correct properties of the entity. So what'll happen is if in my code I add a new customer and then I call save changes, instead of Entity Framework creating on the fly a SQL command to do the insert, it will now use my stored procedure in the database and pass all the parameters into it. So it overrides the default behavior. Keep in mind that later on in this course, when I'm working against this stored procedure, I'm going to make a tweak to the mapping against the insert customer command. So I can do the same for update. And then delete, and delete only has a customer ID parameter, so that maps correctly. It just passes the customer ID, and the stored procedure has logic that'll delete that row in the database. So now for any changes to customer that get sent up to the database, I can use my database stored procedures rather than SQL that Entity Framework would create. I should point out that I created that some new column in the database, and that's now in the customer entity as well. I created that column just to demonstrate the feature of updating the model from the database, so it's not really involved in my stored procedures, which is why I don't have a parameter for some new column. There's a lot more to learn about working with stored procedures in the Designer. Since that hasn't changed much since Entity Framework 4 and Visual Studio 2010, I'll point you to the Stored Procedure Focus module of my Designer-supported EDM customization course to learn more about modeling with the stored procedures.